Flowers like daisies or these purple cornflowers are quite challenging because they have lots of thin petals, and it's very tempting to start drawing those single petals right away, particularly if they are glowing in the sun and seems to be like the most beautiful thing here. But it is important to build up the shapes, to build the volume first, and that's what I'm going to do here. And that's a good strategy for anything, not just for the flowers. Here I'm just very roughly simplifying the shapes of the flowers, and if you see some of the petals kind of indicated, that's just for me to understand the direction of those petals and kind of the angle of the flower, which way they are facing and how those petals are going to be turned. So, and the leaves are the same way if I want them to kind of have a certain graceful shape. So that's what it is right now. It's not about creating the perfect outline like in a coloring book, but just the shapes basically. And now you can see that the outlines that I created at first, now that I'm bringing the color in, they don't really matter as much as outlines. I'm just going to create this basic darker underlying shape for the foliage, for the greens. And I'm using right now hard pastel for that, but eventually and very quickly I will switch to softer pastels. But right now this pretty dark green is doing a good job setting up this first darker foundation of the greens, and eventually maybe I will blend a little bit to just kind of create the deeper darker value. Though this paper, it's a mid-tone, but it's a sort of a lighter mid-tone. That's why I would need this. Maybe a better way would be to start with a little bit darker paper, but we are not going to match with the color of the paper every part of the composition. So somewhere we might have to do the blending, a little bit of blending, so that's okay, to darken the color. And right now you can see that having that darker background already helps those shapes of the flowers kind of stand out against it. And this is the time also to add these darker centers of the flowers, because it's one of the darkest values here in this composition as well. And now the greens, I did open up the fence. If you look at the reference, that's where it's closed in, and I don't like that. Though in a way I don't like extending those vertical rectangles too much like this. They kind of create a little bit too much emphasis on themselves. But that flower, that top flower in the middle, hopefully breaks them up a little bit, those squares that we see, and hopefully that will work out. So it's one of those a little bit looser sketches where I'm figuring out the composition in the process as I'm working, not making elaborate value studies or color studies. This is a study basically. More focusing on the flowers. That's what I want to show here, how to paint the flowers, how to start with the shape, and also how to contrast the cooler and warmer colors within the flowers so that we show the parts of the flowers, of the petals that are catching the sunlight, and how that changes the color as opposed to the color of those flowers in the shadows. And the fence is in the shadow as well, so we see that darker background behind. Now I'm pretty much ready to start working on the color within the flowers now that I have these shapes established. And of course, at first, setting up the background shapes or just overall these larger shapes blocking in the color. I'm more concerned about the value of the color. Yes, I want it to be close enough, but it's the value that I'm more concerned with, because the color I can adjust. I can make that purple color of the fence grayer. I can make it a little warmer, a little cooler, but I want it to be light or dark enough so that it's close enough in value to what it should be, because that will show me that this is the shadow and there will be brighter sunlit grass behind the flowers, behind the fence. Another very dark area is the center of the flowers, and not all of it, because at the top those centers are actually getting some light, and of course I'm going to exaggerate it, and particularly at the first stage I am going to use those kind of more dramatic colors, but definitely want to contrast the shadow sides of those centers with their more sunlit areas. And we have different shapes, like these flowers. Some of them have those more cone-like centers, larger, taller, and that one is going to be different a little bit from those that are more kind of a disc like. So now it's time to start adding some color, blocking in the color in the flowers. And even though I'm kind of working, showing the direction of the petals with my marks, I'm not focusing on separate petals. Right now it's not about separate petals, but more about kind of shaping the overall plane of the petals, basically, of the flower. And if I want, I can also indicate a little bit some of those petals, like here within that flower, that overlaps the flower behind, because that's a great way to bring the detail in from the outside of the flower. But it's not really the time yet for fine detail. There's a lot of work to be done first. And I started with a warmer, kind of reddish. Wasn't really purple, but kind of burgundy sort of. And then I'm switching to the cooler, kind of red purple color, still close enough for the shadow. At this point my marks are larger. I'm working with the flat side of the stick a lot, because I don't want to start creating that thin linear detail as much. And even if it does resemble kind of single petals, they are still pretty broad marks. So eventually I will introduce that detail, but right now it's more about the overall color. And now with this brighter pink color, more saturated color, I'm going to get the areas of the flowers that are more sunlit, that are actually catching the sunlight. And again, not just working petal by petal, but kind of the overall area of the flower. Working this way lets me simplify the shape of the flower quite a bit, so that I'm not lost in all the detail, in all the petals, and I see clearer, and I can indicate right away clearer which plane of the surface of the flower is catching more light, because the flowers are not just like flat saucers. We can see some of them more like a cone, or maybe like compare it to an umbrella. Some of them, and some are more open, but still they are not flat. There will be one side slightly slanted and turned away from the sun maybe. And besides, we have shadow from the fence here as well. So we have these variations of shadow and light on these flowers. And that's what makes it so interesting to play with the color here, with the cooler and warmer colors. Here, if I add a little bit of this brighter orange to those two colors that I already had, it's also adding a little bit of that sunlight, perception of the sunlight. I added a few highlights with this very light pink color. That's not because it's time to start working on the detail, but I wanted to create the full range of values from the lightest color to the darkest colors that I already have here in the painting. That helps me to judge how light or how dark the colors are. For example, that brighter pink, I can see now it's not the lightest color. Before it was difficult to tell that, so this full range of colors definitely helps to evaluate the value relationship in the painting. And I can spend a little bit of time now developing some of the foliage and starting with the darker color again. And now this is the soft pastel, and the soft pastel is going to give me that more dramatic, deeper, rich green color. So what I had before was kind of giving me an idea where the foliage is going to be, but you can see how soft pastel actually makes that color a lot deeper, a lot richer. And here I just want to overlap with the foliage that other section of the fence so that it's not jumping out as another rectangle. So wherever possible, I want to downplay those harder straight lines or more kind of defined geometric shapes. And of course, it's the fence that's creating those kind of very rigid geometric shapes. So I'm trying to downplay that contrast wherever possible. And sometimes, because I'm making certain parts of the picture darker, that again starts creating a stronger contrast between that and the edge of the fence. So here's what's happening. That lighter section of the fence right now adjacent to the foliage, that will need to be darker. So making it this darker gray is going to make it closer in value, a lot darker, and that eliminates that hard edge, that contrasting hard edge, though it's still pretty straight edge of the fence, but because the value of the foliage and the value of the section of the fence is a lot closer, we don't perceive it as a high contrasting area. And what it does, it helps the viewer to move around the picture better, because otherwise the eye is getting kind of trapped, stopped in the area of the high contrast, and we don't want that to happen. We want the viewer to explore the painting, to explore the flowers probably more than the sections of the fence. I can silhouette those flowers a little bit more. And of course, before I just had barely enough pigment on the surface just to indicate the overall major color, kind of basic color for the fence and for the grass behind. But now with the softer pastels, I can start bringing in more pigment, and I can start shaping the petals with that negative painting, meaning painting around the shapes, and carving the petals, carving the leaves with the background color. And here, for example, like this was a larger, this kind of purple shape, but now I can get some petals carved out of it. And this brighter green is showing through those darker leaves, and that creates a little bit of interest and a little bit of that nice contrast there. But also I don't want that bright green to be just all the same all throughout from top to bottom, because I want to create a bit of an illusion that out in the distance it's changing. But right now, again, it's just that overall color blocking for this, just to get more pigment in. And you can see it starts coming to life. Now that I have the color for the flowers, I have some of this brighter green happening, and it creates a nice, lovely contrast. I can see right now that I probably will trim the top a little bit, because I still don't like that kind of alternating geometry happening there. I like the flowers, how they kind of talk to each other, almost having a chat, and that's what attracted me basically. Here it's like a group of flowers, and they're turned at different angles, and the way they are leaning, and of course I exaggerated some of it to kind of give it more character. But there should be some character like this. Like when I'm painting trees, I kind of see certain character in those trees, the way their branches are, the way they are leaning, and same thing with the flowers. So those lines, they definitely bring something with them, bring that kind of emotional aspect with them as well. Well, if my green becomes a little too similar to the background green, you can see how it's almost starting to create a hole in a painting, in the leaf. So I need to change it with that a little bit cooler green, maybe a mid-tone green. So things like this I need to pay attention to. And now let's change a little bit that color in the brighter green background, the color that's closer to us. Maybe we can see a little bit more ground showing through the grass there. I want to bring a little bit more ochre there. So that green is a little bit different from the green that I'm going to end up with at the top. So that's how we can create a little bit more depth. And here I can try kind of a little bit of that cross hatching sort of, but this is still pretty much the same value green that I had before. Because I want to create the illusion of depth, I want to show that the grass in the distance is getting a little bit lighter. That's why I'm switching to that lighter green. And also I can add a little bit of texture if I want, just maybe to show a little bit of that grass texture. But let's get back to the flowers. Let's kind of shape a little bit more the centers. The centers are very interesting. There's like a pattern going on there. And I wouldn't suggest you get stuck on that pattern, because that just might end up looking too much, particularly if your style overall is looser. And then all of a sudden you spend a lot of time on one particular element, it's just going to look out of place. But just showing a little bit, suggesting that pattern with some of the diagonals over there, crossing diagonals, that still works. And it looks like this color in the lower right corner needs to be a little bit darker so it reads better. And now I can start shaping up the flower petals more because I have this nice darker shapes. Now I can actually start using lighter pinks, lighter reddish, purple colors, and start picking up the lighter values within those darker purplish shapes. And that will give me nice petals, nice shapes of the petals. And here, maybe like adding some highlights on the flower stems. That brings a nice detail as well. And if I really want to bring some light on it, then I will use, like I did, this brighter, lighter green. So that brings a little bit more sunlight in that pot, and maybe spend a little bit more time on the centers to build them up a little bit more. And from the centers, I have those petals radiating away from it. So I want to add some spacing between the petals, and we can actually see those spaces. They are a little bit darker. And also the stem that's right under the flower, for example, it has some shadow from that flower. So that's why I darkened that. And just here and there adding some touches, refining the color, refining the flower shapes, and maybe some foliage as well, though that's going to stay more abstract. I'm not going to spend much time on defining leaves. Here in the foliage on the left, it's really more like a darker green pattern. That's what I wanted it to be, and it's fun to add some marks, kind of more free, more spontaneous marks there. The whole drawing turned out to be quite loose, so I want to keep that character, and also just looking forward to give more shape to these flowers. And here with the gray, with a darker gray, I can actually carve into this green, darker green color on the left. Maybe let that section of the fence show a little bit more. But then again, I'm just trying things out as I go because it's a sketch, it's a study, and I want to see how things are working out. And if I feel like I still need to have the color, that gray color, a little bit darker, that's easy to do. And now also while I'm refining the color of the fence, I can also shape the petals of the flower that's overlapping it. So I'm carving right into that pink with this gray, and I also make sure that flower has the petals that are not as predictable. So some of them are turned up, some of them maybe like drooping a little bit down. I don't want them to be very symmetrical. I want them to have more character. And here, if I feel that I need a little bit more of that darker color, I would do that. And with that lighter pink now, that's what I mentioned before, even in the area of the shadow, I can come in with that lighter pink and create some of those lighter edges of the petals. But if I lost the highlights, those highlights that I had before on this flower, top, middle flower, I can add them now again, but also I can start adding the highlights all around the flowers. because now I build up enough color, enough volume. Now I can actually add those lighter highlights on the petals and leave them be. So these are more final touches, more final accents. And as I'm doing them, as I'm making these final marks, I also want to make sure, again, they are not just very symmetrical. There's a character to that. And once I make a mark, that should really stay. A mark like this with a lot of pressure, kind of very pronounced, contrasting mark, that should really stay. I shouldn't be very fussy about making changes to that. And I decided to add a little bit more of a purplish gray. So here with that gray, I can carve some of the petals of this flower, larger flower on the right. So I did. And that purple in this gray, it creates a little bit more harmony with the color of the flowers. So that's why I decided to add a little bit more of that here. And I like the way of defining the petals, not so much as drawing them from within, but using that negative painting technique, because between kind of working from within the shape and working from the outside, it's less likely to become a very predictable shape. So that's why I'm doing both, working from within and working from the outside. And here I'm starting to extend some of the petals in certain flowers, again to kind of downplay the harder edges of the fence. Like this lighter flower at the top, I extended its petals and now it's overlapping that edge of the fence. That works out better, and I probably will need a little bit more highlight on that as well. And a little bit more kind of red and orange on the centers of the flowers, so it gives them more volume and it kind of creates the illusion of that fuzzy top. So I like that, and I like that kind of feeling of the sunlight it brings with it, those brighter colors, and a little bit of texture as well. And here on the petals of the flower that's mostly in the shadow, I'm going to bring a little bit more of a brighter red, because it seems like it's getting a little bit of that backlit effect on some of the petals that we see. But right now with this kind of darker maroon or darker burgundy color, I also added a little bit of the spacing between the petals right at the center, where the petals were completely kind of blending in value with that background fence. And this lilac color seems like a good color to do that. It's not much lighter, but at the same time it does stand out against it a little bit. Now let's see what happens if I add a little bit of this lighter kind of yellow orange. So it's a nice highlight there, and I want to make a little bit more different some of these petals here on this flower, so that they don't look the same length or facing all the same way. There's definitely a range of colors within these pinks, these purples. And also with this red, I'm adding those backlit petals, kind of a hint of that color that we will see in those backlit petals. That's why. But I also love how it brings more energy into the picture. And again, if I need to trim the petals a little bit, the background green is something that can do that. And I think the flowers are shaping up nicely. They have these lovely highlights. If you're enjoying this demo, please show that to me, give it a like, and their YouTube is going to see that too, and it's going to show it to more people, and that's very important to me. And just getting a little bit more definition as far as the petals now, separating maybe them a little bit, but the lighter colors within those shadows should not be as light as the lighter colors in the sunlit part. So that's important. Really love that lighter glowing color, and even if I have to tone it down a little bit with the spacing between the petals, I think it's still a nice color for that, and it's still staying within the shadow, so that's fine. So the only thing that kind of got a little bit lost in translation here is this left flower. It didn't get enough attention, but it's okay. It's still a simplified shape, and it does provide background for the flower in front of it. Also, if you are interested in painting flowers with pastels, you can check out my self-study course, Luminous Flowers. You will see the link to it in the description.